change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And then midnight comes, and God does what he says he's going to do concerning the death of Pharaoh's son, and also the handmaid, her son. And then you have this captive in the dungeon, and he dies. And the dungeon here, the word literally means the pit house. And then we're told that everyone in Egypt, in every home, somebody died. But there was not one death that occurred in Goshen among the Hebrews. They were all protected by the blood, because if you're protected by the blood, you're safe. And that's the same for us as Christians. If you're protected by the blood, you're safe, and neither life nor death can harm you because God protects you. But if the blood does not protect you when you die, you're going to go into eternity and you're going to be totally unprepared. Okay. And so by the morning, I'm pretty sure that the Pharaoh, he wished he had listened to Moses, but it was too late. And though we saw last week that the Pharaoh swore to kill Moses, the next time he saw him again, he now calls Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. And this is in the middle of all the wailing in Egypt. And it's probably in the middle of his own crying for his own son. And you have to remember, it's not just the young sons that died. It was every firstborn in Egypt. So that means that it was old people and young people. There's grandparents, there's babies, there's moms, there's dad, there's children, and a whole lot of animals. And Pharaoh, he doesn't just let the Hebrew people go. He commands them to go. And Pharaoh, he's receiving a lot of pressure from his own people because the Egyptian people, they're telling the Hebrews to hurry up and get out of there before they're all dead. And then while the Egyptians, they're burying their dead, Israel, it marches boldly out of Egypt. And you have to remember here, we're talking about 2 million to 3 million people. And they're taking all these spoils of Egypt with them. And they did not leave in chaos. They left orderly, because it says here, it says it's like an army. And so they marched quickly, and they even had their flocks and their herds with them. And nobody was too weak or feeble to march. And it says that they traveled from Ramses to Succoth. And Succoth, the word means shelters or booths. So this may not have been an actual city, but it may have been a place where they encamped for the night. And then we read here that there's a mixed multitude that's traveling with the Hebrews. And that word in Hebrew for mixed multitude means swarm. And it's the same word they used when that plague with the swarm of flies. It just means a swarm. And so this is a group that's made up of mixed marriages between the Egyptians and the Jews. And it's also other Egyptian slaves who are observing God's power. And they've seen this opportunity to be freed from their bondage along with the Jews. And so they wanted these benefits of being God's chosen people. And the truth is everywhere where God's people meet, there's always a mixed multitude. There are people who are not God's people, but they want the benefits of God. They're just not his people. And we're going to find out later in the book of Exodus, this mixed multitude, they're going to cause a lot of trouble in the wilderness. And this is exactly the same way it is in the church. And Jesus said it himself when he says that not everyone who says to him, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. But we know that even though this mixed multitude is not Israel, that God is still not prejudiced against those people who are not Jews. Because this chapter, when it ends, it gives us instructions to anybody who was not Israel who wanted to share in the Passover how they could. But you have to really, really want to, because if you want to share in this Passover, you have to become part of Israel. And it's going to take quite a commitment on your part. because you're going to have to become circumcised with everybody that's a male in your family. So that's a big commitment to want God so much, because you're going to have to want him so much to become a Jew. But this Passover, it's only for family members. But this offer was good for any stranger who wanted to become part of the family. They could with a commitment. All right, and we know that this event occurred in 1446 BC, and the reason we know this is because there's a reference in 1 Kings 6:1 that says that the Exodus was 400 years before the fourth year of King Solomon's reign. And there's two places in the Bible when they'll say there's like some kind of contradiction where they'll say that this lasted for 400 years, and here we read it's 430 years. The 400 years was just a general sense that this would last for 400 years. But we also read that it's 430 years in Galatians 3:17. All right. So now we're kind of done with the study, and we see them all leave Egypt. And now this is what comes to my mind. It's the day after. Okay, so Israel left Egypt, and what would it look like the next day? So you got all these Egyptians, and they're out there burying their dead. And then you have these Egyptians who had buried their dead. They kind of wander over to the land of Goshen to see what happened to the Jews over in Goshen. And then they show up, and then there's this ghost town. And there's no people, there's no animals. Every door is open, just swaying in the wind, back and forth. And there's blood crosses on everybody's house. And so it's kind of like this day after the zombie apocalypse, or maybe it looks like the aliens came down from outer space and they took everybody away and they captured them from the town. And then they look over and then they see all these footprints, over 2 million people, the tracks making a path going in one direction leading out of the town, which is very, very spooky. And I kind of believe that this is exactly how it's going to look when the church is snatched away from the earth in the rapture, where all God's people will just mysteriously disappear. All right. So anybody here that doesn't have a relationship with the blood of Jesus Christ applied to their lives, come and talk to me. We'll pray, because we can take care of that. We can pray. We can ask the Lord to apply it to your life so that you know that you will be saved from death. You'll be saved from your sins and the penalties, and he'll pass over you. So we left Moses last week with Moses and Aaron being driven out of Egypt by the Pharaoh, along with all the people of Israel, old, young, men and women, all the children, the flocks, the herds, and they all left orderly, not in chaos, but like an army. And no one was too weak to march, and no one was left behind. And as we described last week, when they left, it was like a ghost town with all their footprints only going in one direction, into the wilderness, over 2 million people. And on every door of every house was a cross painted in lamb's blood. And so now with Israel on their journey and Egypt behind them, the Lord begins to instruct Moses and to tell Moses that all the firstborn that open the womb are his, all the animals and all the humans. And this is only fair, because he just saved them all from sudden death, from the death of the firstborn that struck all of Egypt. And so when he saved them, he claimed them all the firstborn for himself. He will explain this later in the book of Numbers, what he did when he struck the Egyptians with that plague of the firstborn. And it's not because there's anything special about the firstborn within themselves, but what made them special is what the Lord did for them. So it wasn't anything about themselves that made them special. And then the Lord goes on, and he reminds Moses in his instructions to stay away from leavened bread, which is bread that's made with yeast, during this Passover feast and the 7 days that follow, which is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that feast always begins with the Passover. And that feast is still practiced today, and it's not some joyless feast, because it begins with a party on the first day, and it also ends with a party on the last day. And this is where they have to get rid of all the leaven that's in their homes. And it's kind of like our New Year's resolution, where you're getting rid of all the old leaven and you're going to start this new year fresh and sinless. And these rules are going to apply in the land where they're going. and they do know where they're going. They are going to that land that was promised to their fathers, to the 12 tribes of Israel. And then it goes through all the names of the people who are currently living in that land of Canaan, the people that they're going to dispossess. And so it's kind of a good thing here for us to start getting used to these names, because we're going to see this list over and over and over again. And the names are the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, those Jebusites, they were that ancient people that actually were the residents of the city of Jerusalem. And it says that this land is flowing with milk and honey. And milk, it means that it's full of pasture lands. And then honey means it has a lot of pollination, which means there's a lot of flowering fruit trees. So this is good agriculture. And removing the leaven in their homes is very, very serious to God. And God says they're to teach it to their children, because they're supposed to remember this deliverance from Israel by their God forever. And so it says there in verse 9 that they are to keep it, as it says, as a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law will be in your mouth. And what this is supposed to mean by saying in your hand, it means, well, it's in your hand. You're supposed to do them. You're supposed to do these works. And between your eyes means you're supposed to think about these things. So you're not supposed to forget about your deliverance. And if you've ever seen the Orthodox Jews, the ones with the long beards and the little hats, and they kind of look like the Amish people, or if you've seen like the Hasidic Jews with the long robes and the long beards with the shrouds over their head, or those ones with those fur hats that look like those Russian kind of hats, like the kind of came from like a James Bond movie, you can see them all trying to take this passage literally, where they have these little boxes that are called phylacteries. And inside of those phylacteries and those little boxes are these little tiny scrolls. And what's copied on those little scrolls that they put inside of these phylactery boxes are 4 passages. The passages are Exodus 13, 1 through 10, and Exodus 11 through 16, which is exactly the passages that we're reading here today. And then on the other scrolls, they have Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21. And then you'll see them, they'll strap these on their forehead, and they'll strap them on their hands with this leather straps. But if it was God's intention for them to fill this passage physically, or to do it literally in this way with these boxes, well, then they probably should have made one for their mouths, because it also says that the law may be in your mouth. So you can see here, this passage was never intended to be carried out literally as a physical sign. And then God is saying that when they get settled in this land of Canaan, that every firstborn animal is going to belong to him. So if that's a lamb or a goat or an ox or a clean animal that's used for sacrifice, they're to dedicate that to the Lord for sacrifice. But if it's an unclean animal, like a donkey, an animal that's not used for sacrifice, you're supposed to substitute a clean animal in its place of your lambs, if you want to keep that donkey. So if you find that having a donkey is more valuable to you than having a lamb, then you offer a lamb to keep your donkey. But if you find that that lamb is more valuable to you, then you have to kill that firstborn donkey by breaking its neck. All the other donkeys after that you can keep. But this only applies to the animals. You have to redeem your children. You're not allowed to kill them, so you have to redeem all your firstborn sons with a sacrifice. But unclean animals and human beings are never to be sacrificed to God. And then we're going to see later that God is going to substitute all the firstborn sons that were saved from Egypt, and they're going to exchange them for all the men of the tribe of Levi, where the men in that family will be set apart as a tribe of priests to God. And the whole reason for this law of redemption was instituted for Israel. It wasn't because the Lord had any pleasure in any of the death of these animals, but it was so that every time when an animal was sacrificed, the children of Israel would know how much their God loved them and how much that he was willing to do for them to save them. because there was going to always be a discussion going on. That's like it says in verse 14, where it says, this discussion, it would be all year long. And it says, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? You shall say to him, by strength of the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So they would always be reminded. This was never to be forgotten. And this was supposed to be discussed pretty much every day of their life. So this story was to be told over and over and over again, because what God did for Israel was so great, and it's all because of his great love for them. And he wants them to know this love, and he never wants them to forget it. And we saw this redemption put into practice in the New Testament when Mary and Joseph, they brought their sacrifice and they offered in the temple when Jesus was born. And then after God had given all these instructions to Moses, we learned that when the people left Egypt, God wasn't going to lead them by the short route. And that short route would have been called the Way of the Sea, which is called the Via Maris, which was the common trade route. And if they did go that way, it was only 110 miles, and it would have only taken them about 11 days. But the reason he didn't take them is because this land was still under the control of Egypt, where the Egyptians, they would have had military outposts all along this whole way. And so we're told the reason why God didn't take them by this route, and it was because God didn't want his people to be in fear of war. And even though there was over 2 million Jews here, they weren't warriors. They were slaves. They would never be able to stand a battle against the Egyptians. They would have just been slaughtered. And beside all that, they didn't have any weapons. All they were carrying were things like food and things for their survival, like their tents and their pots to cook in and their cooking utensils. And then at the first sight of any fighting, they would have wanted to return to Egypt. So even though the Via Maris, that they would have had these easy roads and they would have had plenty of food and water along the way, they couldn't see the dangers, but God could see them. And he didn't want to throw those Hebrews into any kind of situations that they're not prepared for. He didn't want to overwhelm them. So God takes them into the wilderness by the Red Sea. What God is going to do, he's going to take time to teach them and to train them, because eventually these people will be great warriors. But being slaves, there's a lot they don't know. And though it only took one night to take the people out of Egypt, it will take God 40 years to take Egypt out of the people. And this is exactly the same way that God lovingly treats us when we come to Christ, when we become his child, where you have just come out of the world and you're saved. When you come out, you have the world's ideas, and you have the world's ways, the way the world thinks, and it's been there your whole life. Where now, even though you know God, you're not totally changed in one day. And it takes time for the Lord to take the world out of you. He takes the time to teach you and to train you. And he always does this in a very loving and gentle way, because like them, he doesn't want you to become afraid and to return to the world. So you're saved in one moment, in just one day, and then he leads us through these many experiences where he teaches us how to know him better, and it's making us like himself and taking the world out of us. So God here, he has planned the best way for Israel, though no one would ever understand why he had chosen that way, and probably nobody would have agreed with him that this made sense. At least no military strategist would. And you kind of wonder, because Moses, he was a former military strategist. So he may have even had a little bit of trouble with it, but we don't read that here. But before they leave, Moses goes up and he picks up Joseph's coffin. And you can read about that back in Genesis 50. And in Genesis 50, you'll read that Joseph's coffin, it was never buried. So his coffin had been laying above ground for about 400 years, because Joseph had made the children of Israel promise to take him with them when they returned to the land of Canaan, because he knew that God had promised that. So Joseph here, he will be the only one of the 12 brothers of the 12 sons of Jacob who will be buried in the land of Canaan. All the other 11 brothers, the other heads of the tribes, they're all buried somewhere in Egypt. And this is the same Joseph that not only saved the Hebrews, but Joseph here, he also saved all these Egyptians when they had this world famine. And so you have these 2 million people, and none of them would have been standing there unless God had done this work through Joseph's life. And his body would have been perfectly preserved because he would have been like any other Egyptian mummy, and he would have been done really, really well, just like a pharaoh. And so eventually when they do come up and they bury Joseph in that cave at Machpelah, along with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there will be 2 perfectly preserved mummies in that tomb. The other ones will just be a bunch of bones, but these guys will be perfect mummies because they also did this to his father Jacob before they all went up and buried him in that cave. And this is going to be a great encouragement to the children of Israel as they carry his coffin around with them for the next 40 years. Because when they seen his coffin in the camp, it would remind them of all these promises that God had made to them and how God had been faithful to Joseph. And that would encourage them that God would also be faithful to them. And so now they leave the Succoth, and Succoth, that means encampment. And then they camp at this place called Etham. And nobody knows where Etham was located, but we do know it's on the edge of the wilderness. And then we're told about this pillar of cloud that will go before them. And the word pillar is an ancient Hebrew word, which literally only means something standing. And we read here that this pillar is identified with the angel of the Lord, and occasionally he'll actually speak from that pillar. And this wasn't just like a little pillar, like a column. This was a huge pillar because this pillar gave these people shade in the daytime, or else they wouldn't have been able to endure the sun in the desert. There's not a lot of shade in the desert for them to travel comfortably. So we're talking about a pillar that makes enough shade for about 2 million people. So this is a really, really big pillar. And so now if this cloud moved, they moved. And if the cloud stopped, they waited. If the cloud turned left, they all went left. So it was actually pretty easy to follow because all you really had to do is you had to stay in the shade. And this is how God had led them through the wilderness. But at night, that pillar of cloud turned into a fiery pillar. And that fiery pillar was bright enough for them to travel, for every one of them to see where they were going. So it wasn't just a little light or a small fire. And we're told that this pillar, it never departed from them for that whole 40 years that they were in the wilderness, because God never left them on their own. He never deserted them. And this again here is the same for us. God will never leave us or desert us. And he also gives us light, and he gives us protection in the shade of his presence as we travel on our wilderness journey in the world.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,